I went out with my roommate to pick up some Navy guys in a village that had been hit. And when we got there, we found out there were no Americans on the ground. There was a Navy enlisted man on a boat about 5 miles away, along with his Vietnamese counterpart. The village was burning. Their little compound had been overrun. And my roommate was a crazy guy who went on to win the Medal of Honor during his second tour. But we landed in this village alongside the compound that had been hit. And we started taking tracer fire from 2 different directions. And I looked over at Pat Brady was his name, and he used to chew tobacco all the time, have a big thing sticking out, spitting out the window, not paying any attention to what was going on. Right. So I learned then that it's best to just sit there and be calm and let the bullets go by you.
Yeah, that's interesting because most people, when they hear gunshots, and most people, when they're getting shot at, go the other way.
Yeah.
But you guys, not only did you fly towards the gunshots, you're when they're loading people onto your helicopter, there's nothing you can do about it. You have to sit there.
Have to sit there and do that.
What goes through your mind when you're doing that? You can't shoot back. You can't leave. You just have to sit there. Do you say a prayer like, please get me home, Lord?
I guess we did. I'll tell you about one experience. I was sitting at a rice paddy, and they were shooting at us from a woodland about 100 yards away. And the 2 gunships that were flying cover for us both got shot down. And they hadn't got the wounded on board yet. And you could see behind me, you can see a fire extinguisher behind me was bolted to the side of my seat here. And a armor-piercing round came through and hit that fire extinguisher and pierced it, caused it to start spinning in its bottle, and it spun the this thing was bolted to the side of my seat, and you see the hole that's punched in it here. Okay. It caused this thing to start spinning, and the handle and the spray assembly caught against the side of my seat, and they fell off on the floor, and my side of the helicopter just completely filled up with smoke. And I thought we were on fire. So I turned to my co-pilot, I said, Ray, we're on fire. And he said, yeah, man, we're on fire. So I reached to get the fire extinguisher handle, and all I came up with was just this part of it, because it had spun off. And what the smoke was the propellant coming out of this thing. I couldn't even see out the window.
And that's the actual extinguisher that was...
That's the actual extinguisher there, yeah.
Wow.
But we finally, and the bullet went through, and I don't have missed my bottom. It went through the bottom of my seat and out the other door and hit my crew chief in the arm. And I didn't know he'd been hit until we took off, and we took, 30 hits or so during that time frame, because they were shooting from 100 yards away. And I heard some noise in the back there, and I was trying to talk to the 2 gunships that had been shot down, and I found out they were okay. And I kept hearing this noise back in the back, so I said, hey guys, what's going on back there? And my crew chief said, sir, Tiny has been hit. Tiny was our crew chief. And our medic said Tiny had been hit. And I said, Tiny, you've been hit? And he said, yes, sir. I said, where, Tiny? He says, in my arm. And so I looked back over my shoulder and saw the medic climbing over the wounded we picked up to get to him. And then I heard laughter back there. And I said, guys, what's going on back there? And my medic said, sir, you're not going to believe this. Tiny's going to be okay, but he's real pissed off right now because a bullet had hit him right here, and he had 3 cherries tattooed on his upper arm here, and a little inscription said, here, mine, where's yours? A bullet went right through the middle cherry and blew it away. So he was okay. But he wouldn't go home. He refused to go home. The doctors and my commander wanted to send him home, but he didn't want his mother to know he'd been wounded. And a month left before he was supposed to go home. This occurred 3 months before he was to go home. A month before he was going home, he begged the commander to let him start flying again. And unfortunately, jumped off the helicopter to help a captain who'd been hit, and both of them were blown away. Both of them were killed on April Fool's Day of 1965.
So you go back to Vietnam for your second tour. Is that by choice, or were you told you're going to Vietnam?
No, it wasn't by choice for sure, because I only spent 2 out of what was supposed to be 3 years in Japan.
Yeah.
But the build-up in build-up in Vietnam had begun, and we were at our peak, I think 578,000 or something at the time. And I went back to command a unit that was supporting the 25th U.S. Infantry Division at a place called Cu Chi, about 35 miles north of Saigon.
This is 1968?
68, 69, yeah.
Okay, so the war in Vietnam is full bore. We've got hundreds of thousands of troops there.
Yeah.
What is the immediate thing that you notice that's different on the second tour?
Well, the late in our first tour, the North Vietnamese began to send North Vietnamese soldiers down, and they were highly trained, very competent soldiers. My second tour, it was mostly North Vietnamese, and they fought in much larger units. Rather than fighting at platoon or company level as they did during my first tour, they'd fight at regiment or division level, in fact. And so they were very tough. They had good weapons and lots of rockets and mortars. And so it was just a different war.
Yeah. Were the tactics that your unit deployed, the medical helicopters, were the tactics any different, or were they
No.
pretty much the same? You did the same?
We'd go to a battle site, and the guys on the ground, as I said earlier, tried their best to protect us if they could, set up perimeters and fire back and that sort of thing. And we had wounded and dead on the ground, so we landed. And we got shot up a lot more than we did my first tour, a lot more.
Would you have known? So you probably knew, or I would think, had a feel for where the combat was happening every day.
Oh,
like
yeah.
Where you would most likely be going.
Yeah.
So you got a briefing. Okay, this is going to be a hot spot today. We should be prepared.
Yeah. The 25th Division had 3 base camps with fire bases all in between. And we'd go to the nightly briefings and sometimes hear what they were about to do the next day, what areas they were going to try to surveil and that sort of thing. And of course we were monitoring the radios all the time so we could hear what was going on in some places.
Right. How was the Huey to fly? Tell us about that aircraft.
Great airplane. It had plenty of power. I think the most I've ever had, I had 26 people on it, crew of 4, and the Vietnamese we picked up, and that old gal got off the ground and got us back to Saigon. I had to make a running landing because I every time I tried to slow down, the nose would start tucking, so I had to make a running landing and skidded across the ground and dumped everybody off. Right. But it had incredible power. It had fair speed. We could fly 120 miles an hour. So we could get to particularly during my second tour, most of our pickups were within 20 minutes. So a unit on the ground get hit, have wounded, we'd be there.
Yeah. And these are H models.
Great airplane.
The second tour is in H models.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you've written a memoir, and the title of the memoir is pretty catchy, A Bullet Through the Helmet.
Yeah.
Why do you call it that, and tell us that story?
It happened. That was probably one of the more dangerous days during my career. We got called out about noontime. They had a fellow wounded in the 2nd of the 12th Infantry Battalion, and who had sent 2 companies down a road to try to interdict a North Vietnamese unit that was headed for Saigon. And they had a couple of wounded. So went out there and they couldn't secure the landing zone. And finally they called me and said, well, my medic tells me this guy's going to die unless you can pick him up. We'll do our best to suppress the enemy if you'll be willing to come in. I said, we're on the way. So we landed and started taking hits. 2 Viet Cong jumped up out of a foxhole or a spider hole about 100 yards from us and fired a rocket-propelled grenade at us. It hit a tree limb in front of us and just broke our windshield. But we came out of there. Then about 7 o'clock that night, we got called back again. Very, very dangerous. Got shot up again. And then at midnight, another mission for the same unit. And then at 4 o'clock in the morning, went out, and these two companies had consolidated and were about to get overrun. They were under heavy attack. So the battalion commander was flying in a command and control helicopter, and initially I asked him to shut off the light, shut off the flares that were being dropped, so I could land, and at first he refused. And by that time I was a brash young major on my second tour, so I said, you don't want me to get shot down landing or taking off, turn out the flares and let me land, and then I'll call you when I'm on the ground and you can start the flares again. So he finally consented, and I turned all the lights off on the helicopter we went in, and I turned on my landing light when I got down to the bottom, and I could see a small clearing in the jungle, and I could see wounded laying all along a road. So I landed kind of in the middle of where all the wounded were, and he started the flares again, and we started taking hits. I could hear rounds hitting the tail boom in the back of the helicopter. And we finally got loaded. We picked up 8 wounded, and we started up. I asked him to shut the flares down so I could take off, and he refused. He said his units were under heavy attack. We took off, and just as I cleared the top of the tree line, there were just sheets of tracers coming up, hitting the bottom of the helicopter. A round came up through the left side here by my knee and hit the collective lever and ricocheted off and split my left thumb open, and that hurt like a son of a gun. And then I heard a scream behind me, and the medic told me that one of our patients had been hit in the back and it killed him. Then something hit me. A round came through the windshield down here where the windshield bolts in the frame, hit my flight helmet right between my eyes and came out behind my left ear here. And when it did, it brought a bunch of metal and plexiglass, went primarily into my left eye, cut my nose and chipped out a place up here and chipped out a place back here. And I threw the stick. It hit me hard enough. My head flew back and I hit the back of the seat. And that hurt like a son of a gun. But I threw the stick, and my co-pilot said I jammed the right pedal all the way to the floor, and I pulled the collective lever all the way up. So we rolled over like this, and I looked down again, and I looked at the artificial horizon and on the dashboard, and I could see we're a descending right turn headed for the ground about 100 feet away. So I got the stick centered and centered the pedals and pulled in some power to start climbing again. I told my co-pilot I had been hit, and he took over and flew us back to Cu-Chi. But I couldn't see out of my left eye. Didn't know what had happened to me. All I knew was that something had hit me, and I could feel something warm running down the left side of my face. And so for some reason, I closed my left eye, and I could still see the instrument panel clearly. But then when I switched and closed my right eye, I couldn't see, just a blur of lights. So that's what happened. All that metal and plexiglass. I had a piece of plexiglass about that long sticking right here in the corner of my eye.
Yeah.
And a bunch of small pieces that they dug out over the next 4 or 5 days.
Yeah. So, and you didn't crash.
Thank God we didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. And you have a co-pilot. Does he have any control over the helicopter at this point?
We always had both of us on the controls when we're landing or taking off in a combat situation.
Yeah.
But I had thrown the stick hard enough, I threw it out of his hands, and I jammed the pedal out of his foot, and I jerked the collective lever up. And when I told him I'd been hit, by that time he's trying to grab things too.
Right.
He got everything centered and flew us back. And that's the young man that lives out near you, near in Oaksville. He saved us that night because we had a fire warning light come on, and I mean we were leaking every fluid aboard the aircraft.
Yeah. Now, when you were shot in the head, I mean, obviously, people don't know on the helicopter. People don't know. All they know is you've been shot.
Yeah.
And there's a fear that you might be dead or unconscious and you would fall forward.
Yeah.
What would the ramifications of that be? Had you fallen forward?
Oh yeah. We had a lever on the side of the seat that the guys in the back could trip and pull us back into the back.
Okay.
And when I told my co-pilot I'd been hit, my crew chief in the back, Rob, reached over and threw his arm around my neck like this and started pulling me back, and I knew he was reaching for that lever. And I kept yelling at him, "Turn me loose, Rob! Turn me loose! Turn me loose! I'm okay." And he finally turned me loose, and And that's when by that time I had gained some of my senses back again.
Right. How long were you out of commission?
I was in the hospital for 5 days. They were concerned that I'd been knocked unconscious. And if that were true, then my flying days would have been over. But so I was in a neurology clinic for 5 days. And each day they would take me to another hospital that had a ophthalmologist. And they'd go in with a 60 gauge needle and pick those things out of my left eye here. And they finally got them all picked out. And I went back to flying again 2 weeks later.
Yeah. But as I remember it, you weren't supposed to go back that early, but there was a mission that you got and you were able to get back on flying status.
Yeah. 2 weeks after I got back to my unit, I got a call that the chief of staff of the 25th Division wanted to see me. And so I didn't have any idea why. So we went running over there, me and the medical battalion commander. And he told us that a mission had come in to, the North Vietnamese were planning to perhaps release 3 prisoners of war on Christmas Day of 1968 up on the Cambodian border. And they wanted a medevac ship to pick them up. That had been negotiated in Paris. And so I told him I could fly that mission. And he said, "You just got out of the hospital." I said, "Sir, I can get back on flying status in a heartbeat." So he told me to pick my best crew and to do that. And we went up on Christmas Day, and the mission didn't happen. But then several days later, we found out they were going to release them on the 1st of January. So we took off from Tay Ninh and flew about 50 miles across the jungle tops until we found a North Vietnamese flag flying in a little tiny hole in the jungle. And I told the guys in the back, I said, "Hey, that's probably it. Let's land and see what happens." So we landed near this Vietnamese flag, North Vietnamese flag, and didn't see anybody. We were in this tiny clearing, not much bigger than my house here. And about 10 minutes later, 8 heavily armed North Vietnamese soldiers come marching out of the jungle, and they formed a semicircle right in front of us, took their weapons off and held them at breast like this, and just glared at us from 10 feet away. And we sat there for probably another 20 minutes, and we saw movement coming out of the jungle up to our right up there. And I saw what appeared to be 3 Americans in lighter colored uniforms. And one of them was a black guy, and he was stumbling along like he could barely walk. So I told my crew chief in the back, I said, "Hey, jump out and see what these guys in front of us do. And if they don't do anything, go help that guy." So he jumped out, and they didn't do anything. So he went hustling up through the jungle, got this guy's arm over his shoulder and brought him back to the helicopter. And then the commander of the unit, of that North Vietnamese unit, stopped him about 10 feet away. And they went through, read all kinds of proclamations and this sort of thing. And then about 15 or 20 civilians came out of the same jungle, and they gathered around us and started taking pictures and what have you. And they wouldn't let them load till all these photographers and what have you were there. Mm-hmm. And finally, they made us load them one by one. They took pictures, and one guy ran around to the front of the helicopter, and we've been told we couldn't have weapons, we couldn't have cameras or any kind of recording devices. And so one of the cameramen ran around to the front of the helicopter, stuck his camera up against the windshield over on Jim Daly's side, and we weren't supposed to do anything. But we had a mic button on the floor here. I could step on it with my foot. I stepped on it and I said, "Jim, don't smile, but your picture is going to be on the front page of the North Vietnamese paper tomorrow." He started laughing. I said, "Jim, don't laugh, don't laugh." And the guy moved away, and then we took off and took the prisoners to Long Binh, and we were just excised. Nobody would talk to us about it. And I didn't even know what happened until 15 years later when I went to War College and got all the classified papers from Paris and from the CIA and other agencies, and learned how the negotiations had gone.
Most people have, especially when you're young, you just got over there, especially for your first tour, and you played this role in your second tour. But most people have somebody that they look up to, or they are inspired by, or they are mentored by. Oh. Did you have some of those people over there, especially for your first tour, that kind of helped you and shaped who you become?
I had exactly that guy. His name was Paul Bloomquist, a good Mormon boy out of Utah. Paul had been there a year when I got there, and he had volunteered to stay 6 months more. And Peter Arnett, one of the famous American artists, newspaper reporters, asked him why he'd extended 6 months. And he said he liked the job, he liked what he was doing, thought they were the best crew to do it. And I flew with Paul many, many, many times. And he just unbelievable guy to work with. He stayed 3 years in Vietnam. He finally married an Army nurse and was sent to Germany. From there to command a battalion. And 3 days before he was to come home from Germany, he walked across the street to the officers club to change some dollars into marks. So he and his wife were taking some friends out for dinner on economy that night. And he walked up the steps into the officers club, and a Red Army terrorist group was in Germany at that time called the Baader Meinhof Gang had placed some explosives inside some flower pots at the entrance to the officers club. And just as he walked past them, they exploded and killed him. So he spent 3 years in Vietnam, 4 Purple Hearts, I think 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses, to be killed by a group of terrorists in Germany.
Yeah. And he had a profound effect on you.
Oh yeah, yeah. He taught me a lot. Taught me how to fly.
Yeah. On a lighter note, when you were in Japan, especially, did you fly anybody? The U.S. tow tours came through there, I'm sure. Did you have an opportunity to fly anybody around? Martha Raye, I know, was very popular over there, and some of the other actors and actresses.
The whole time I was there, we had the only Hueys.
Yeah.
There, there was a little flight detachment that supported the headquarters, U.S. Army Japan, but all they had was 2 little Goldfish Bowl H-23s, only carry 1 or 2 passengers. Right. So we got tasked from time to time to fly senior military officers who were coming to visit, going to Vietnam, and were stopping in Japan on the way over. And a lot of the movie stars, Bob Hope, flew Bob Hope. We flew Rosie Greer, the football player. You just mentioned her name, the nurse.
Well, there's Martha Raye.
Martha Raye was there several times. Yeah. Nancy Sinatra.
One name that stuck out to me in your book was Ann-Margret.
Ann-Margret.
Because you not only met her in country, but you met her again many, many years later.
Yeah.
Tell us about her.
Yeah. My second tour in Vietnam, my first tour in Vietnam, we flew Bob Hope around, but I had picked up some wounded Vietnamese and was coming into the Vietnamese hospital, which sat alongside the airfield there in Saigon. And I jumped over the fence going back to the parking area, and we're hovering along the ground about 20 feet off the ground. And my medic in the back said, "Hey, look to our left." And I looked, and Janet Leigh had walked out on stage. The stage was in front of one of the hangars. And Bob Hope was standing there with Janet Leigh, who was dressed in a white bodysuit. So I kicked the tail of the helicopter around. We started hovering sideways down the taxiway until the tower saw us and told us to get the heck out of there. But my second tour, the same group was coming. And I had my officers in a meeting one night, and I said, "Guys, I don't want to see Bob Hope. I've seen him before. I need somebody to fly with me. I'll fly first up that night or on duty that night." And one of my guys was an older fellow who had gone to school at Northwestern, was working on his master's degree in psychology. And he got fed up with the anti-war movement and dropped out of college and joined the Army and became a warrant officer helicopter pilot. He spoke up and he said, "Sir, I used to date Ann-Margret when we were freshmen at Northwestern. Do you think I could see her?" Of course, the other guys started saying, "Oh, combat wounded," and all this kind of stuff. So when I knew he was serious, I called the public affairs people and said, "Hey, here's the relation." So Doug was picked. His name was Doug McNeil. Was picked to fly her and Bob Hope and the other group around the area, and then he borrowed my Jeep and brought Ann over to my unit. So she spent quite a bit of time with us in my unit. Many years later, it was I think my 40th high school reunion at Branson, Missouri. I told one of my guys at the Pentagon I'm going for this thing, and he said, hey, Ann-Margret performs at one of the clubs there. And so I looked at the schedule for when we were going and found out she was going to be there. So I sent a letter and I sent pictures of her I'd taken in Japan. And I told her that Doug McNeil had been killed. So when we got to the show, my former wife, who passed away many years ago, we sat down in the seat. Somebody tapped me on the back and said, are you Colonel Moore? And I said, yes. And he said, Ann-Margret wants to see you when the show is over. We'll send somebody to get you and bring you back to the green room. So when they did, they took us back, and there were probably 15 or 20 other actors and people, friends of hers and whatever there. And when we were introduced, she threw her arms around my neck, and I thought she'd never turn loose. And she asked about Doug and how he had got killed, and I told him he was picking up a wounded guy. They thought, the guys on the ground thought they had it secured. He landed and a .50 caliber hit him in the chest and killed him. She started crying, and we stayed about 15 minutes, and I said, Ann, we need to go because we had another show. And she says, no, you're not going. And she hung on my arm for probably 30, 40 minutes, and a whole group of actors and other people came in, and she introduced us, my wife and I, to all of them, and kept telling them, this is one of my good guys from Vietnam. My tours in Vietnam were my favorite tours of all time. Wonderful lady.
Yeah. I would imagine that nothing, however, that you would have done after that, after you left Vietnam, would have been as rewarding as what you did there.
No, you're right. Between Vietnam and Japan, I carried, if memory serves me correctly, 11,396 patients in a Huey. And I'm convinced that some of them went on living or had limbs saved because my crew and I could help. So when people ask me about Vietnam, I say that if there's anything that could be considered a good job in combat, I had one. And I think saving lives and saving limbs was well worth it.
Yeah. In fact, you referred to those 4 years, 2 years in Vietnam, 2 years in Japan, as the best years.
It was the best years of my military career.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And people would look at you and say, you were getting shot at. Not only shot at, but shot.
Yeah.
And yet still, you have fond memories of that time.
Sure do.
Yeah. And that's because of how significant your contribution was, saving these lives.
Yeah. I've seen 3 of the patients that I picked up that survived. Both were badly wounded, and it was good seeing them after many years.
Yeah.
The people I served with, we had some crazy guys who did crazy things, and you'd laugh about it. I'll tell you one story. One afternoon, there was a large North Vietnamese Army unit that was located about 30 miles north of Cu Chi. And I flew out there about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, picked up a guy who was sick, wasn't wounded. It was an American airborne unit that was to cut these guys off. And while I was sitting on the ground, one of the infantry commanders came over and stuck his head in my window and in a slow Texas drawl said, "Hey, sir," said, "y'all better get ready." He said, "We expect we're going to have a real pissing contest on our hand when it gets dark and these guys try to break out." Well, I came back, and we knew it was a large North Vietnamese unit, didn't know how big it was, and we knew there was only 1 battalion of 101st Airborne. So I came back and I told my guys, and we all went over to our radio bunker. We turned the radios up so we could listen to them. At about 9 o'clock, all hell broke loose. And then we got a call that they had several wounded. So I launched 3 helicopters. We went out there. My lead aircraft was ahead of me. In fact, Doug McNeil, the guy who was killed that flew Ann-Margret, he was the first guy in, and he got loaded and got shot down coming out of the LZ. And he put it down at a rice paddy about a mile or 2 away. And I landed alongside him and got his patients and his crew, took them to the hospital and came back and joined my other guy. And in probably about 40 minutes, we carried 26 badly wounded guys to the 12th Vac Hospital. And I've told people if something like that were to happen at a stateside or a military hospital here nowadays, all chaos would reign. But the 12th evac handled those guys quickly and efficiently, and the hospital commander told me later on that all of them survived, all of them lived. Well, after making sure that my crew that had been shot down was okay and making arrangements to get my helicopter picked up out of the rice paddy at daylight, I finally got in bed about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was sleeping soundly when something woke me up. And as I got awake, there were 6 or 8 doctors from the 12th evac standing in a circle around my bed. And I heard one of them say, "Well, let's wake his ass up." And a bucket of water hit me. Those guys had treated all those patients we brought in for 6 or 7 hours, saving their lives, drank up whatever booze they had left, and came down to wake me up for keeping them up. I mean, those kind of crazy things, and there are dozens more stories like that of crazy things that guys did. And so I don't have any bad memories of Vietnam at all.